On December 16, 2022, India's Finance Minister, Mrs. Nirmala Sitharaman, speaking at a FICCI event, warned Indian industries of climate tariff walls.
When you're going to export your steel, you will be facing tariff walls in the name of climate action tax. This is going to affect us. There's a role that the government and the industry can play together.
So what are these additional costs which Mrs. Sitharaman is referring to? And what is the role which she is referring to that Indian government can play in reducing the burden for the Indian industries? These are some of the questions which we would like to discuss today. And for that, I have a very special guest, Dr. Badri Narayanan. Dr. Badri Narayanan is an applied economist and data scientist. He wears several hats. He is a member of Global Trade Observer. He is a fellow at Niti Aayog, and he is a faculty at several global universities. Dr. Badri Narayanan, most important, is also developing 𝗧𝗕𝗔𝗠 database, which is a key economic tool to measure economic impact of CBAM regulation. Welcome to ELP's Trade Dialogue series. This is episode 2 of this dialogue. I am Parth, a partner with ELP specializing in trade and competition issues. Hello, Dr. Badri. Welcome to the ELP podcast series on CBAM.
Thank you, Parth. Great being part of the show.
Thank you, Dr. Badri. Dr. Badri, before I get into the specifics of the role that Indian government can play, let me first understand from you, how do you think the CBAM regulation is going to play? How effective it is going to be in combating the threat of climate change?
Thank you, Mr. Parth, for the wonderful question. CBAM has been one of the most promising tool by any country or any region in the world to effectively impose steps and create incentives to reduce emissions, not only within the country but also abroad. So definitely in terms of intention, it is quite strong. In terms of its effectiveness, there are many hurdles. First, if you're talking about compatibility of this kind of a regulation with the WTO regulations, right? The WTO compatibility, there are questions, and many countries are taking a step towards fighting with the EU on this. But of course, it's not a black and white thing. It's a gray area. EU can potentially defend itself. There are certain articles that allow for environmental provisions within trade. So this can be there. So that is more about how tenable this can be globally. The second aspect is how effectively is it going to reduce emissions? So I myself have done a lot of analytics and research on these kind of issues in the past, environmental standards, labor standards, and how they affect trade. One thing I've seen from these research papers is that there are two things that are likely to happen. One is trade diversion away from these countries to other countries. So when EU is making it too costly to export to them, it is quite likely that countries can start preparing to export to other countries. So that is one thing that I've seen that happen in the past instances, although nothing of this scale has happened before. So at a relatively smaller scale, this trade diversion can happen. Second, that is what EU wants to happen. Like second consequence is what EU would want to happen, and that is the countries work hard to abate emissions and comply with all the standards and then export to the EU. I think in reality, we are looking at both of them happening. Some countries may end up doing this and some countries may not do this. Some companies in some countries can do. So there's going to be a lot of heterogeneity here, right? So you're looking at both these happening at different levels. the third dimension to this is what ties with my previous concern, and that is to what extent are the countries going to perceive these as an opportunity to reduce emissions vis-a-vis a hurdle raised by the Europeans to not to kind of compete with their domestic market. So in a way, kind of erecting, like you also mentioned, like our finance minister mentioned, it's kind of a non-tariff barrier, right? So I think that it all boils down to that actually. So that's how that is going to drive companies to do this or that. So all these are different possibilities. So I'm sorry I could not come up with a very specific pointed answer because the world is uncertain. There are so many possibilities. I just was trying to come with a gamut of different possibilities that can happen. And the reality is going to be a combination of all this.
Thanks, Dr. Badri. I think that's perfectly fine. I think I hear you saying that at this point in time, it's very difficult to really predict the effectiveness of the whole regulation vis-a-vis combating, this whole threat of climate change, so to say. But you also mentioned the important point, which is that there would be a trade diversion. There is a likelihood of trade diversion, and that also takes, leads to the question, which I think you vaguely referred to as well, is that it's not very clear that whether it is intended towards protecting the domestic industries or companies within EU, or how much of it is to really combat climate change. Now, given this whole trade diversion effect, do you see a likelihood of this being used, therefore, as a tool to somehow protect the European industries? And if they do so, how effective that is going to be? For example, right now they have covered 6 sectors. Now, you can have a trade diversion effect for sectors where you think there is self-sufficiency, but you can't really have it for all sectors, because then your own imports will become pricier. So in a long term, do you really see that this is going to be more used as a trade protectionist tool by European Union?
I always think of reality as being somewhere in between, like my answer to the previous question. It is a mix of both. They genuinely want to reduce emissions for sure. And in that process, if it can protect the domestic industry, they're going to be happy. So that's, I think, how I think about it. And it's no policies are made with a single pointed goal, right? So definitely it's kind of one stone killing 2 birds kind of thing, right? So, and that is how it is going to be difficult for the EU to defend that they are not doing it for non-tariff barrier. At the same time, it's going to be difficult to fight, for others, countries like India, to show that they are indeed doing it, using it as a non-tariff barrier. So I think it's a double-edged sword. It's a very smart move on the EU's part. I personally, I think it is definitely, it can be thought of as a non-tariff barrier.
No, absolutely. I think surely there is a range of views on CBAM regulation and motivations behind it. But just keeping aside the motivations behind the whole regulations aside for a moment, the fact is that it is a reality now. The law is in place, so to say. By October 2023, reporting obligations will begin. Now, given the law is there, right there, knocking at the doors, it's imperative that the governments of exporting countries will have to take, suitable decisions so as to see how they can minimize the cost to their exporters. And as you rightly heard, Ms. Sitharaman speaking at the FICCI event, she does refer to a role that the governments can play along with industries, right? She acknowledges that Indian government has a role to play along with the industry to reduce the cost or reduce the burden on the industry. And I was just wondering, what role do you think Indian government should or ought to play at this point in time?
I think the biggest challenge for a country like India in this regard, I think many people probably may not agree with me, is that apart from all the other things that we usually talk about, right? We talk about the cost of compliance, non-tariff barriers, we already talked about all these things. They're all there. But a fundamental question is, how are we really going to measure these things, right? So we don't even know how much are we emitting. I have done a lot of work on this from a data perspective, right? Like when developing this global data set and so on. The only way we could actually estimate these things are at a macro level. Now the question is, how are you going to do at a company level? And this is real-time data. What I'm talking about is estimation. We estimate. We just say that, okay, this is the dollar amount of output, input, and so on, and this is the implicit emissions, right? So the word implicit is important here. Whereas what we really need is data set statistics at a company level. Somehow it's just like the way we measure temperature, the way we measure humidity, and a lot of other things. There should be some way to assess the emissions coming out of the each company. We have to make some efforts on creating data sets and measuring the emissions at a granular level. And secondly, we need, I think we already discussed about other challenges. Government has to play a very careful role and a balance of definitely not challenging the process of climate change mitigation, because we are committed to that. But at the same time, we don't like this being imposed from outside, and also the timeline being imposed from outside. Of course, we all understand the urgency of climate change combating and so on, but we have 1.2 to 1.3 billion people to feed, and we have a lot of other priorities. So the government has to play this very calibrated, meticulous role of, on one hand, cooperating globally for climate change mitigation, taking leadership. More than cooperation, we can take leadership on that. But at the same time, we have to, be very careful about being imposed. So that is the second thing that the government should do. There has to be some kind of foreign policy interacting with our environmental policy and industrial policy. And thirdly, I think the industrial policy bit, right? So we have the PLI schemes, and they are already involved in some of the transition industries, right? We have semiconductors, electronics, and so on. Solar panels are also being thought about. So we have a lot of these industries. So that the PLI schemes are great, and there should be more schemes targeted at this kind of CBAM support kind of thing. Some kind of incentivization for transition has to be there. Tax rebates and so on. And finally, government also has to work on capacity building. Large companies are relatively better off, but the smaller companies are clueless. When I spoke to a lot of MSMEs in India, they are really clueless. They even many industries supplying to these large industries and so on. So I think they have to, a lot of capacity development as well. That is also tying in with the foreign policy management. So we can actually talk to the Europeans and say that, why don't you guys help us? Instead of just telling us what to do, you can actually partner with us, and you can help our industry in terms of know-how. You might have heard of this Just Energy Transition Partnership, where we are discussing that in real time with EU, with Germany, and also other G7 also, right? So those kind of things I think should be done on a more engaging levels. And finally, R&D. We need to do a lot of R&D here. And again, R&D, despite all the efforts we are taking in India, we definitely have to lean on the developed world, because there's a lot more cutting edge research going on there. So we have to have a lot of technology transfer and technology collaborations to accelerate the energy transition.
Thanks, Dr. Badri. I think you make very important points on this, including on the point that we should have capacity building for, really assess the impact of the CBAM. And government certainly has a role to play on that. But specifically from a legislative perspective, you would have read in the newspapers, the government has recently announced, with the amendment, the Energy Conservation Act, it has recently announced a voluntary carbon credit trading system in India. And of course, EU law also at some level recognizes that if you have a carbon trading system which is linked or perhaps recognized by EU ETS system, then there is some level of benefit to the exporters, in the sense that the credits which they get in this country will be perhaps recognized in Europe. And from that perspective, what do you think the government should do at this point in time, legislatively? How should it really structure its carbon trading scheme or carbon trading trade system, so that it is aligned with EU system and the Indian exporters could take benefit of that? What specific steps do you think the government should take in this regard?
The ETS in the EU has been quite effective, the emission trading system, like you rightly mentioned, and I also alluded to in one of my points before. It's a really wonderful and very timely move from the Indian government to do this energy conservation amendment bill, which talks about this voluntary emission trading. From a very academic theoretical point of view, we do think about this cap and trade, carbon taxes, and this tradable permits. So all these as tools for reducing emissions. And the most market-friendly way of abating emissions is definitely this kind of emissions trading. So in that sense, I think this is a great step. But I think in terms of its effectiveness, I think it's only going to be effective if we also have a good accounting system, like the ETS system in the EU has, right? So if we do not have a statistical and accounting system that I was talking about for the previous question, it is going to be very difficult to implement this thing. So I think we have to work hard on that, because long ago, I think when we had this Kyoto Protocol, there was something called Clean Development Mechanism, as you may recall, and CDM. And the biggest complaint about CDM, it was a wonderful idea, wherein the developed countries can do emissions abatement in India and then or other developing countries and then claim credit. It's exactly like ETS at a global level. But it somehow didn't work well because of this lack of accountability and also measurement. So it's difficult to measure. So I think that measurement issue should be taken care of. I think that is a fundamental issue in the ETS-like system that we can have here. Of course, I must also make an important point here that all these legislation schemes and new regulations and so on, they need very in-depth study. We have to commission a lot of research on it, academics and think tanks working in detail on that. I know some organizations are working on it. I've been in touch with them, but I think a lot more has to be done here.
No, absolutely true. I think it's not that the government alone has to do its job. I think industry also has a role to play here. As you rightly also mentioned about focusing on R&D and other related areas. And that also brings me to the point on the role that industry itself can play. So as you would have read again, that many Indian companies are adopting the internal carbon pricing mechanism as a tool to reduce carbon emissions. And I was just wondering, alongside with the government, what do you think, what are the steps or measures which Indian industry should adopt in order to remain cost effective and neutralize this additional cost of carbon border adjustment tax?
One thing the companies can and should do is to also be early adopters. So if they are early adopters, even before CBAM comes into picture, even before any of these regulations come into picture, they can actually start commanding a premium. So they can recover that 70-80 rupees just by the price tag. They can say that, okay, we are already CBAM compliant, and this is the price we command. If you want to pay us, pay us. If you don't want to pay, we have others who can buy from us. Because we should always remember that although EU is doing the CBAM, the European importers are always going to be looking for companies that can reliably supply commodities that are CBAM compliant and have least carbon tariff, right? So So if you make an early impression, you can penetrate those markets early, right? So that is one thing. And other thing the companies can do is to have a lot of collaborations. So maybe some companies might have figured out how this works, but others may not have. So they can help each other, because there's going to be a lot of coexistence. Because if you don't actually help each other, because different companies might have figured out different pieces of the puzzle, but now they have to work together to bring that all together. And R&D you also mentioned, and I would also like to re-emphasize that there has to be a lot of in-house R&D, and they have to forge. I was talking about government, but even companies should forge partnerships. Because I've already seen a lot of interest on the ground in the EU, in Japan, in US, many other countries, to collaborate with Indian companies, because they have the R&D, they have the technology, they're willing to transfer to the Indian companies who are willing to take them up and implement them. We want to basically make use of India as a production hub for all these technologies. So I think we have to do a lot of looking out. Our companies have to do a lot of looking out for this. And I think human resources also, they have to invest a lot in human resources who can actually solve a lot of these things. So that ties in with R&D, but also more operational. Even at operational level, we have to have the right human resources, because there are a lot of new processes. We cannot afford to just have the routine set of human resources who can just implement what has been done in the last few decades, but we need a lot of new kind of skills, and skill development is needed there. You cannot let the universities do their part alone, or the government to do their part alone. Industries should collaborate with them to come up with skill development programs to be consistent with this kind of abatements.
Thank you, Dr. Badri. I think the key takeaways for the Indian industry then is early adoption, right collaborations, both outside India and within India for skill and development, and of course, a lot of investment in R&D. Dr. Badri, it has been a pleasure to have you here in our podcast series.
Thank you so much, Mr. Parth. I enjoyed talking to you, and it was quite thought-provoking. I'm looking forward to more discussions. Thank you.